Good morning. Welcome. Welcome to the session on connectors and mail routing in Office 365. I hope you guys are having a good Ignite so far. I mean, I will be quite honest with you. I was thinking to myself yesterday, what kind of committed individual would come at 9 a.m. in the morning for a session on connectors? But I'm so glad to see all of you here, and I hope to reward your commitment with a good session and some useful information. So that being said, I'm Khushru Irani. I'm a program manager with the transport team in Office 365, and our team is responsible for managing mail flow in Office 365 as well as Exchange. Now the goal here is rather simple. I'm trying to simplify the whole connector aspect with you. We should be able to walk away with an understanding, a basic understanding of why connectors are needed. We'll go through some more detailed scenarios also in this session, and I'm going to walk through scenarios with you. We're going to go together on this journey where we'll go through various scenarios, understanding why connectors are even needed in the first place, if at all you need connectors. And I'll try to dispel some myths about connectors, what are inbound, outbound. There's so many things that are associated with them. And all this while, I'll demo the new connector UI. If any of you guys have already seen it, that's great, but we'll get a chance to see the new Wizard UI as we walk through this. Now, the next two slides are really a kind of a glossary. I put them up front so that you know what I'm talking about in terms of terminology, but I want to make sure we are on the same page here, all right? So the next two slides, I'm just going to skim through with the names. So first of all, we have Exchange Online, and the two kinds there. We're talking about hosted or fully hosted. When we talk about them, we're talking about customers that have all their mailboxes in Office 365. A hybrid customer, on the other hand, is one which has some mailboxes in Office 365 and some that are on-premises. And on-premises meaning your organization, right? And finally, you have Exchange Online Protection, where in a situation like this, customers have all their mailboxes on-premise. They're using EOP to protect them from spam, malware, and other attacks. The other participants that are going to be in our scenarios that I'm talking about here are, of course, the internet. We have Bob at yahoo.com. We have your organizational email server. And John at contoso.com is actually going to be a user that has a mailbox in your organization. Jim at contoso.com, on the other hand, is having a mailbox in O365 in the cloud. And then I'll talk about two other players, if you will. There is an email service provider, for instance, Message Labs. A lot of people use different email service providers for different reasons. And finally, your partner organization, like a bank. In this case, very conveniently, bank.com. All right, let's get started with our scenarios. And you will learn these players as we go along, okay? So the first scenario is fully hosted. In a fully hosted scenario, you have Contoso. Contoso.com wants to move to Office 365. They want to move their mailboxes. So it's a small business, and they want to move. They want to go all in. In a scenario like that, the first thing that Contoso.com does is they register their domain. So they register themselves with Office 365, and during the registration process, they have to verify that their domain is owned by them. So there is a process involved there that includes adding a text record with your DNS provider to ensure that your domain is owned by, in this case, Contoso.com. And this is an important step because this verification step tells us that you are the owner for this domain. And we use that later. So Controso.com is registered as an accepted domain. They then go ahead and add users. And finally, they make the MX record for Controso.com pointing to Office 365. Now, this step is also required at your DNS provider. So if you have a DNS provider like GoDaddy or whoever, you would go and make these changes there. When you do that, what happens is Controso.com gets an MX record that points to controso-com.mail.protection.outlook.com, and you will get, as you can see, A records with a bunch of IP addresses. That's what the world is going to use to connect to Office 365 and send mail to controso.com. I mentioned region-based IPs just because depending on which region you are from, if you're from North America, you get North America IPs. If you're from Europe, you get European IPs, and so on. Now let's talk about, in this case, a question, do you need a connector for this scenario? The answer should be overwhelmingly no. Because when somebody like Bob at yahoo.com wants to send mail to Jim, Jim is in the cloud, that mail uses the MX record and goes directly to Jim in the cloud. There's no connector required for this scenario. Okay? Now let's talk about Jim trying to send mail to Bob, the other way around. In that scenario, just like you had your MX record registered, it's very critical. I mean, this step is forgotten by most people. It's very critical to get your SPF record registered too with your DNS provider. This SPF record needs to inform the world, basically. It's a text record in DNS. It informs the world that Office 365 can send email on your behalf. Our IPs can be used to send email. And maybe 5, 10 years ago, SPF checks weren't done that often, but today almost everybody does that. And having this step performed is critical to ensure that your mail doesn't go, for instance, in people's junk mail folder. They'll just treat it as spam. If you didn't register your SPF record, for instance, send that mail to Yahoo, it's quite likely that Yahoo would consider your record as spam. So when you include this record, question again poses in front of us, do we need a connector for this scenario? The answer is no. You have your SPF record set up correctly, your mail will go from Jim at controso.com to Bob at Yahoo, and everything's good. Now, some of you might say, well, you know, I actually have a scanner, a printer in my office. I mean, we're talking about a small business here, okay? So I go to my scanner, I scan a document, that document gets emailed to me, and in a scenario like this, how is that going to work? You've got to ask yourself two questions. The first question you're going to ask yourself is, can that scanner, and most scanners can, especially the Office variety, can it talk SMTP using TLS 1.0 and higher? Now, a reason why I said 1.0 and higher is because until a few months back, we supported SSL 3.0, but that has enough vulnerabilities that caused us to remove SSL 3.0 support. So your printer has to support TLS 1.0, 1.1, 1.2. So you've got to ask yourself that question. And then you've got to ask yourself a second question, which is, can the scanner authenticate with a username password? If the answer is yes to both, do we need a connector for this scenario? Now, you might probably be observing a pattern here where I'm asking myself this question every time. And there is a reason for that, because one of the myths that we have is we need a connector for a bunch of things that we actually don't need a connector for. So in a scenario like this, do I need a connector? The answer is no again. And the reason for that is if your printer supports these two aspects, you would use SMTP client submission to authenticate to Office 365 and send email. What that really is you would create a user account in Office 365 for that scanner. Now, you could create the same user account. If you have multiple scanners, that's okay. You can have one user account, and all these scanners can use the same account. Once you've created that account, then what you'll do is that scanner is going to talk to the smtp.office365.com endpoint, authenticate with a username and password, and be able to send email, just like a regular user would. You could even send email outside. But the good thing about this is, A, if you are a small business and you're using shared IPs, you don't have a dedicated IP, you are working out of some ISP like Comcast or somebody that's providing you with an IP address on the fly, they are okay with you talking client submission because that is going over port 587. A lot of ISPs do not allow port 25 to be used over SMTP. That's why this would be the preferred way to actually go ahead and send email as a scanner. Now, some of you might say, well, Khushru, I'm not sure whether my scanner uses TLS 1.0 or not, and it cannot authenticate with the username and password. Now, I hate to say this. The question I don't hate to say, because you can still ask this question, do I need a connector for this scenario? The answer is no for that too. But what I hate to say is that it's going to be hard for you to work with a scanner in this kind of scenario. And we will talk later in a hybrid environment how you could use connectors, but that comes much later. For a simple case like you have a small business, you just have a few scanners that you use, or a scanner or a printer, for that scenario, what I mentioned earlier in the previous slide is your best option. In this option, you can still use what we call direct send. Now, it has to support TLS 1.0 at least, because we don't accept anything less than TLS 1.0. But in this case, you don't have to authenticate. You could just use direct send where the scanner, so scanner1@contoso.com, sends mail to jim@contoso.com. That mail just goes through like anybody else would send mail. Now, the reason why I said that your mail is probably prone to be marked as spam is because that scanner is sending mail through a shared IP again. That IP could be on the block list. Comcast IPs get on block lists. Or, for instance, you also have the situation where you're not registering that IP with Contoso.com's SPF record. So that could also fail. Because of those reasons, this is not a recommended way. The previous way of authenticating is the recommended way. So if you are going to be purchasing a new scanner or a printer or a device, you want to make sure that it supports TLS 1.0 and higher and can authenticate using SMTP. Now, some of you, in the small business space especially, you guys use email marketing third parties to send marketing software on your behalf. We all receive marketing email, and so you guys will outsource that to some other company, in this case very conveniently called emailmarketing.com. So Contoso.com in this case has outsourced their marketing campaigns to go out of emailmarketing.com. Most likely emailmarketing.com will use an address such as do not reply at emailmarketing.com. That's what we call a P1 address, P1 from. But they will use a display from address on your behalf, like jim@contoso.com. We call that the P2 address, P2 from, right? And they will send that mail to, say, Bob@Yahoo or anybody else on the internet on your behalf. Sometimes they might also have a reply to field populated with jim@contoso.com, so that emails that you reply to go to Jim. Now, in a situation like this, do we need a connector for this scenario? Does anybody think we need a connector for this scenario? No. If you're following the pattern, the answer should be simple. The answer is no. And the reason why you don't need one, in fact, I would go as far as saying this mail should not pass through Office 365 at all. Because emailmarketing.com is going to send an email from their own environment, to bob@yahoo.com or whoever else they need to send that mail to. That mail is going from emailmarketing.com, which is a good thing in that hopefully they've registered their SPF records correctly. So when Yahoo receives that mail, the SPF check will pass because it's being sent from emailmarketing.com's IPs Keep that in mind. It's being sent from emailmarketing.com's IPs to Yahoo, and it's being sent from. The P1 from is still emailmarketing.com. So the SPF record will pass in that case, which is good. DMARC, on the other hand, which is another standard that's used to validate P2 addresses or the display from, might not pass. But there's no reason for having a connector in this scenario, and it's not going to make anything better for you by having one. All right, now let's move on to another scenario, which is a fully hosted customer that has a hosted website. A lot of you might host your website, in this case www.contoso.com, with a third-party shared service, right? For example, you could be using Azure, you could be using AWS, whatever the case might be, to host your application. When your application wants to send email, they would want to send email as contoso.com. So in this case, that application is sending mail from do not reply at contoso.com to Bob at yahoo.com. I pose the question again. Do we need a connector for this scenario? And if you've not been paying attention, or if you rather have been paying attention, the answer for this is also no. So, in this scenario, why we don't need a connector is because contoso.com is sending mail as contoso.com. It's actually hosted in a third-party software. Those IPs do not belong to contoso.com. Also keep in mind what you want to do here is this: you want to create a user. You want to create a user that's in Office 365 that represents this application or this account. You would then use EWS or even client submission, SMTP client submission from this application. This application is going to authenticate as that user and send mail as that user to Bob. So because you want to send mail from contoso.com, you want to use an account inside of Office 365 to be able to send that mail so that your mail is not junked or treated as spam. Okay? Now, when you do that, obviously, remember when you create a user account to send email, you are subject to all our sender and recipient limits. So there's only going to be X amount of emails that you would be sending in a day. I think it's like 10,000 or so per user account. So once again, what we've done through all these scenarios is show that most small businesses, there's one takeaway for us right here, is that most small businesses really don't have a need for a connector. They can get all these scenarios that they will deal with, and I tried to cover most of them. There was no need for us to create a connector. So let's move on to hybrid now. Customers that have their own organizational email servers. So at this point in the session, I'm going to have to, we're going to go on a little bit of a history lesson here. Do you guys remember a time long, long ago when there was no Office 365? When all there was the internet and your email organization, your organization with email servers? Well, in that scenario, long, long time ago, you would have your MX record pointing to contoso.com. Now, contoso.com is our hybrid organization. And your MX record would point to contoso.com. And it would have, you would create your MX, you would create your servers, in this case, mail.contoso.com and mailbackup.contoso.com with your dedicated IPs. These are your IPs belonging to your organization. And in this world, long, long time ago, you would have mail from bob at yahoo.com, follow the MX record, and come directly to your organization. Now let's fast forward, and we now have Office 365 in the mix. And contoso.com, like a lot of organizations, has decided to move to the cloud. They've decided to go in a step phase. So what they're going to do in this case is they want to move some mailboxes. Now, every organization has their own pace. Let's talk about contoso.com here. They've decided to move their mailboxes to the cloud, or at least some of them. So what they have to do is the same as what the SMB did. They have to register contoso.com as an accepted domain in Office 365. They do that exactly the same as what an SMB would do. When you register, you got to again verify that you own that domain, and you start adding the users that you want to host in Office 365. You also move your MX record to Office 365. Now, this is not a mandatory step. A lot of organizations prefer to keep, or rather keep their MX record pointing to their organization, even in a hybrid situation. But the preference would be to move the MX record over, just because it has fewer routing complexities and reduces the chances of your mail being marked as spam. And we can talk about that later. But the preference, I'll walk through you the best practice here of moving the MX record to Office 365, in which case, again, contoso.com gets a MX record that points to contoso-com.mail.protection.outlook.com with a bunch of IPs that are specific to the region. Now, one of the things that more organizations want is, in a situation where they have users in the cloud as well as on-premise, they want one happy organization. They want one seamless experience. In fact, the goal is you don't want your users in the cloud knowing that they have a mailbox in the cloud. They actually won't even know the difference if everything is set up correctly. Email and everything else works as if both these mailboxes, the one in the cloud as well as the one on-premise, were both on-premise. So in a situation like this, that's why you want to create connectors, because exchange headers, especially when you have an exchange organization, exchange headers are preserved. If you do the right steps, and we'll walk through them shortly, exchange headers are preserved between the two environments, between the cloud and between on-premises. And when you do that, that's what gives you that seamless experience. All your things just work as if they were two different data centers for your organization. Nothing different. So let's walk through that a little bit. So you've registered your MX record. It's pointing to Contoso in the cloud. The first thing you do is you create a connector in Office 365. Now, we have changed. We used to have these words, inbound, outbound, and so on. And people used to ask, inbound from where to where? Outbound from where to where? I mean, it used to get confusing. So we've removed that terminology, at least when it comes to the UI. And instead, the only place where that terminology gets exposed, if you will, is in PowerShell, if you use PowerShell to talk to your environment. And I've annotated that everywhere with a PSH and what that connector would be under the covers. But you need not to focus on that. What you want to focus on is you would create a connector in Office 365 that points from O365 to your organization. So once you've done that, and you'd say, this connector is going to be used for all mail to all my accepted domains. And remember, contoso.com is registered as an accepted domain. So when you say for all accepted domains, you're really saying all mail for contoso.com needs to go via this connector. You also point this connector someplace. In this case, it's going to be your organization smart host. Now, not to forget, on the other side, in your organization, you would need to create a receive connector that receives mail from Office 365. This receive connector, you'd have to open up your firewall to make sure that it accepts mail from mail.protection.microsoft.com IPs. And in this configuration, all your mail from the internet is really coming through us. It's not coming from any other channel now. So you can have your firewall just restricted to our IPs, because all your mail from outside is coming via these IPs. So in a situation like this, when Jim, who is in contoso.com, wants to send mail to John, who is on premises, that mail basically, when we receive it, I mean, this is from the mailbox, we receive it, we say, okay, this is mail for contoso.com. John doesn't exist in the cloud. Does he have a connector? Yes. That connector actually will send mail for Contoso.com to this smart host, and that's what we do. So we will send that mail over to Contoso.com's on-premises server, the ones that you pointed to, and that mail gets delivered to John. Similarly, mail coming from outside no longer goes to your organization directly. It goes to Office 365 first, because that's where the MX points. We look at that mail. We say, hey, is John in the cloud? No, he's not in the cloud. I'm going to route that mail over to his on-premises server because you have a connector created for your domain, Contoso.com. And we send that mail over, and it's received by John. Now, one thing to keep in mind when I go back, let me show you. A lot of times, or I wouldn't say a lot of times, but occasionally you'll find mail from us trying to get to your smart host, but your smart host has some problems. Maybe your smart host had some memory problems or can't take mail on that particular day for whatever reason. Your certificate has expired. In all those cases, mail is going to start queuing up over here in Office 365. In a situation like that, we have the capability to inform the administrator for that organization that, and this is via Message Center, that your mail is actually being held up in Office 365, and you need to do something to take care of, make sure that mail flows again. We also have now the capability to send an email to an alternate account, because if you're giving the same account, chances are that email is stuck in the same queue. But if you have an alternate account, you can send that, we can send you an email, and that would inform you that, hey, there's something backing up for you. Make sure your smart host is wired correctly. Now, that being said, let's actually walk through a demo of creating one of these connectors. Remember, this is the connector from O365 to your organization. Now, what I have here is the Exchange Admin Center, and this is used for my account. This is actually my own domain here, ardeni.net. And if you look at my accepted domains, I have ardeni.net registered as an accepted domain of type authoritative. And we'll talk about that type a little bit later. But Contoso.com would register their domain just as I have registered mine. I would then go and create a connector. In the past, what you would have is a single page experience, which would be very confusing. People would not know what they need to put in some of these text boxes and so on. But we've tried to now expose this via a guided walkthrough. So what you would select here now, we've tried to remove as much guesswork as possible. So you want to create a connector from O365 to your organizational's email servers. You would select those two, you would click Next, and you'd give it a name. So in this case, from ardeni.net, or rather, sorry, from Office 365 to my organization, and not spelled correctly, but this is how it is. And you would give a meaningful description. I'm just going to call it test connector for now. Now, keep in mind, one of the important things which is already by default checked for you is the retain internal Exchange email headers. This is the one I was talking about as an option that allows you to retain your Exchange headers as they go from Office 365 to your organization. This will give you that seamless experience, okay? Once you've done that, you'd say Next. You then have three options. Where do you want to use this connector? By default, which is probably what most people select, you want to use this connector for email messages that are sent to all the accepted domains in your organization, in this case, ardeni.net. You would then go and say, how do you want to route these messages? Where do you want to send them? So a lot of people might give an IP address of your smart host. In some cases, they might just give a name. For example, mail.ardeni.net. Okay, you can give an FQDN. We'll try the FQDN. When you do that, mail is going to be sent to this FQDN. Now, the third option is, how do you want this mail to be sent? Do you want it, what kind of security do you want? Do you want to make sure that every mail that gets sent out over a TLS connection, which is the default, which is what we would prefer you to do? And then you can decide what level of trust you want. Can any certificate be used? As long as it's signed, who cares? It's still going encrypted. Do you want to use a certificate that's signed by a CA, which is the default option? Or you want to be even more specific, and you want to specify exactly the subject name of the cert that should be used here. So we say, oops, not Contoso. .NET. So this is my certificate. I would use this. Now, when I say next here, it will give you these options, and it's good to read this stuff to at least know that you're doing the right thing. So we'll always use TLS to connect if the recipient's email certificate is issued by a trusted CA and the subject name of the certificate matches mail.rdani.net. Now, the thing that we've added is also the ability to validate this connection. So the next step for you would be to validate this connection. And to validate this connection, you want to give an email address of a recipient. In this case, I would give an email address of somebody on premises so that a test mail is sent to that person and see whether this connector is validated. Now, I won't go through this step right here, but I will go through this step in another scenario as we move along. Okay? But it's a similar concept. Now, one of the things that we did have is you have to validate before you can create this connector. Even if the validation fails, it's okay. It's okay, but you must validate and before you turn this connector on. You can still validate, it could fail, and you could save this connector, no problem. But it's important to basically validate before you cannot turn the connector on before you validate. Okay, so I'm going to cancel out of this for now because I need to go and set up my receive connector on the other side so I can get that validation going. But this was just the first piece of exposure to this UI. Now let's talk about, and I'll go through more scenarios where I'll actually go through a complete validation. So that's the connector from O365 to your organization servers. Now, I touched upon two concepts which are kind of equally confusing sometimes, authoritative and internal relay. These are the two kinds of domains that we have. What does authoritative mean? Let's walk through that. Now, you had Bob sending a mail to John at contoso.com. And you've registered. You have an option, okay? You have an option to keep your domain as authoritative or internal relay. Let's talk about what authoritative means. So in this case, Contoso has decided they want to have their domain set as authoritative. What that means is you must, when you mark your domain as authoritative in the cloud, you must sync your users and groups into the cloud. So we know that this is your final set of users and groups. Because you mark your domain authoritative, that tells us, Office 365, that the buck stops here. The mail stops here. If I don't find that user listed, I'm going to reject that mail. I'm going to NDR that mail. So it's very important that you keep when you mark your domain as authoritative, you are syncing your users and groups to the cloud. You're also, for the users that you have in the cloud, like in this case, I have Jim in the cloud, you want to have, Jim is in the cloud, but John is on premises. For each user on premises, you want to have it represented in the cloud as a mail user object with an external email address. I said a lot of things, by the way, and that's why it can get confusing, okay? So, but the important thing is if you follow these three steps, just keep in mind, got to sync your users to the cloud and groups to the cloud. The advantage with that is that you would get directory-based edge blocking, which means if the mail comes in and we don't find that user, we will reject it at the perimeter. That mail will never go and hit your on-premises box, which is a good thing for most people. They don't want spurious mail, spammy mail coming to their organization. Now, but you pay a price, if you will, where you got to sync your users and groups to the cloud, and you got to mark your users that are on premises with by creating a mail user object, as I said here. So I've created a mail user object for John, and I'm going to point John to the on-premise mailbox by giving it an external email address, that is john.contoso.com. So what happens in a scenario like this? Mail from bob@yahoo.com comes to Office 365. We look at that mail and say, oh, this is for john@contoso.com. You've synced all your users. I found John. John has an external email address pointing to on-premises. I'm going to use the connector associated with your on-premises, and I'm going to send that mail over to John, to your on-premises server through John. Okay? I mean, this is confusing, I know, but at the end of the day, having these steps listed or understanding what they are will make it pretty straightforward on what you need to do. Now let's talk about the other type of domain. The other one is internal relay. Some customers like the internal relay option. Why is that? Because that option doesn't require you to sync your users and groups to the cloud. But because you don't sync your users and groups to the cloud, we don't know what all your users and groups are. So if we get a piece of mail to say abc@contoso.com, and abc.contoso.com is not in your cloud, we will still send that mail over. We will not NDR that mail, but send that mail over to your on-premises because we just figured it's internal relay. You just want us to relay our mail to on-premises. So we'll just send that mail over to on-premises. So you will get a lot of spurious mail. If spammers are spamming you with abc@contoso, xyz@contoso, all those mails will flow right through to your on-premises server. So in this case, mail coming in from Bob to John comes into us. We don't find John in the cloud, so we can't deliver it to John's mailbox. But instead, we will just go ahead and send it across the connector to the on-premises server and relay it to John. So that's the difference between these two kinds of domains. They both have their advantages, disadvantages. Now, let's talk about the connector on the other side. Now, we have John, who's over here on premises, wanting to send mail to Jim, who's in the cloud. Now, John doesn't even know that. He's just sending mail to Jim, obviously. And for you to enable that scenario, you want to have your send connector. You've got to create now a send connector on your premises. And you want to have that send connector send all your mail over to Office 365. So they send all your on-premises email via this to the smart host, contoso-com.mail.protection.outlook.com. You'd also go in Office 365 and create a connector from your organization. Remember, now it's from your organization to Office 365. And you would need a way to prove that this mail that's coming over, when we receive it, how do we make sure that that mail is truly coming from contoso.com? Because it can be easily spoofed. You prove that by using either a certificate or an IP address. And we'll walk through that scenario shortly. So what happens when John sends mail? It goes over, because you've said all your mail from contoso.com on premises is going to be routed to Office 365. That mail is received by us. And you've said, hey, if mail comes from these IPs, it's coming from my IPs. So you've got to put your dedicated IPs. Or the preferred way is, if mail is using this certificate with this subject name, that's mail from contoso.com. Now remember, you've also registered contoso.com as an accepted domain. And the only way you could register contoso.com as accepted domain is when you've verified ownership. So that step was performed too. So when mail comes from contoso.com, which you have verified, and it's coming from using that certificate or coming from those IPs, which you have provided to us, we believe that that mail is coming from contoso.com and is not spoofed. So in this case, mail will be accepted and delivered. Also, when John wants to send mail to bob@yahoo.com outside, what happens in this case, that mail also goes from John's mailbox to the Exchange server on premises, which uses the receive connector or send connector to send that mail to Office 365, and we determine, okay, this is coming from Contoso, just the same verification like before. It's going out to Yahoo. Yahoo is an external domain. I'm going to route that mail out. All right? Now, in all of this, don't forget our SPF record. You want to make sure that SPF does still contain our IPs, because all mail outside is still going via O365. So please ensure that SPF record does include this statement. And when you do that, you're protecting yourself from your mail being considered spam. So that being said, let's now go ahead and demo this part. Now what we have here, now I'm going to create a connector in Office 365, and this time it's going to be from your organizational email servers to O365. You're going to say, when this mail comes in O365, let's give it a name. So in this case, from ardeni.net to O365. Oops. Let's again call it just test connector, but do give meaningful names, because I will say sometimes you forget what they were for. Finally, you would again do the same thing, which you would retain internal Exchange email headers, so that headers that are used from your on-premises get sent to Office 365 or get received by us, or we preserve them. You would then say, how do you want to verify this? How do you want us to prove that this is really coming from contoso.com or from ardeni.net? So you would say, if mail comes from ardeni.net, it would come using this certificate. So please validate this certificate name. And once you've done that, press next, and that's pretty much it. So you've done two things. You've already in the past registered contoso.com as a verified domain, and you've now said that, please, all my mail from Contoso will be using this certificate. As long as it's verified, that's the way my mail will be coming through. So, and the connector gets created. So this is rather simple. We don't do any validation for this kind of connector from your organization. We only validate mail going from your organization, rather from Office 365 outbound. This connector can be created, and then you would have to send a mail yourself from your organization just to validate that it is being received. I mean, John can send mail to Jim, for instance, and outside. Okay, the next thing we have is a summary, but this is simply to keep in mind that if you want, as I said, one happy organization where email between you and your on-premise users and your cloud users are really seamless, you want to create these connectors. Now, you also want to keep these things in mind. These are the common mistakes people make, but you must have dedicated IPs. Do not use shared IPs when you're telling me that this mail is coming from your organization. If you're using a service provider and they have shared IPs, that's not the truth. This IP has to be dedicated. It has to come from your organization. Secondly, TLS or using certificates is a better way to go because it's more secure. Finally, sender domain must match accepted domain. So your organization sending mail from Contoso, contoso.com should be your sender domain. And finally, you do not want, I'll emphasize this, you do not want anything between for the cloud, Office 365, and your on-premise servers. No third-party email service provider or anybody between these two, because that would break mail flow between your organization and us. Finally, this is just a slide for you guys to take a look at later. I mentioned about email headers. All Exchange internal email headers are stripped normally. When we receive mail, we strip off Exchange email headers. You want to preserve them to give that seamless experience. For preserving them, I showed you in the UI those two checkboxes on the connectors. You would also need to go to your receive connector and send connector on premises and make sure you do a similar operation. Okay? Both these steps are required so that your internal headers remain. And there are many reasons why you want that internal header remaining, including making sure calendar works seamlessly and so on. Okay? So that is critical. All right, let's move on. All right, now that we've covered this scenario, in a scenario where you have scanners and printers or in-house applications, these are in-house applications, not hosted apps. These are apps that you have in your own organization. There's nothing special you need to do. Those apps, as well as your scanners or printers, will continue using the same connector. So if scanner1 at contoso.com wants to send mail to Bob at yahoo.com, there's absolutely no difference than John at contoso.com sending mail to yahoo.com. That mail goes to the connector, gets sent out. Okay? So you get that. Once you've created these connectors for that seamless experience, you get that for free. I've also noticed one thing, which is a lot of organizations, they move their setup completely, all their mailboxes to the cloud. But they still keep their smart host and their connectors going just because of their scanners and applications. And that's okay. You may still want to keep that around for your scanners or applications, or if you want to go all in and not have to keep maintaining this smart host on your on-premises or the Exchange servers on your premises, move to the model that I described earlier where SMBs use client authentication to authenticate with the cloud. Okay? So you can do that. Once you've moved all your mailboxes, you can go back and fall back to that mechanism. Now, let's talk about partners for a second. Now, imagine I have a partner, a bank.com, that I do a lot of business with. In a normal situation, bank.com sends mail to Contoso like any other org. So I have Jack at bank.com that's sending mail to Jim. And that mail from Jack will come to me, or to Jim rather, like any other mail from the internet. There's nothing special about this mail. Office 365 will use what we call opportunistic TLS. What that means is when that mail is received by us, when that mail gets received by us, we will apply TLS. We would prefer to apply TLS, but we will apply TLS only if the sender, bank.com, chooses to apply TLS and encrypt the connection. Otherwise, if they don't use that, we will fall back to receiving it in the clear. Okay? Similarly, when Jim at contoso.com wants to send mail to Jack, we would want to go and use TLS, but if bank.com says, I don't support TLS, then we would resort back to sending mail in the clear. So we are really dependent to some extent on the other party, or your partner in this case, using TLS. And most well-known organizations do use TLS. So you get TLS for free for most of your connections. You don't have to create a connector in that scenario. But if you absolutely want, so do we need a connector for this scenario? No. But if you absolutely want every connection or every email that's sent between this partner of yours and you to be encrypted with TLS, then you would go ahead and create a connector. You would basically create a connector of type from your organization. So in this case, you're saying, I want from my partner organization to Office 365. Remember, the arrow is always in the direction of mail flow. So I go and create a connector that says from my partner organization to Office 365. And I also create one from Office 365 to my partner organization. Now, when you do that, what that means is the following. When Jack at bank.com sends mail to Jim at contoso.com, Jim is in the cloud. When we receive that mail, we will first verify that TLS was used on that connection because you've created that partner connector. And we'd say, okay, if TLS is used, then allow that mail to come through. If TLS is not used, reject that mail. So we would reject that mail if no TLS was used. If it was used, we would accept it and deliver it to Jim. Similarly, when Jim wants to send that mail out to Bob, or to Jack in this case, that mail would come to us from Jim's mailbox, and we would validate, hey, is TLS supported, or is TLS actually used by bank.com? If bank.com says yes, that's the only time we would send that mail over using TLS to bank.com. Otherwise, that mail would not go to bank.com. It would get rejected. You would get an NDR. Okay? So the only reason why you want to create these partner connectors is if you absolutely want to enforce TLS with these partners. So that being said, let's demo a partner connector. And in this case, I will actually do a validation. So let's create a partner connector from Office 365 to your partner organization. Remember, this is not your on-premise anymore. This is your partner organization. So I'm going to say from O365 to, and in my case, my partner organization, just humor me here, is xhybrid.com. Okay? And let's see, this is my partner. So I want all mails from me to this partner to be encrypted. Now you got to specify, when do you want to use this connector? Well, I only want to use this connector for all emails sent to star.xhybrid.com. So any mails where recipient domain is star.xhybrid.com, whenever mails are sent to this organization, I want those mails to be encrypted. All right, that's good. And how do you want to route these messages? Well, I want to route these messages. I know the smart host for my partner. You could either use MX or you could use the smart host. So I actually know the smart host of my partner. I want to be really secure. I specify the smart host IP. So I'll basically say add an IP or FQDN. So let's add an IP here, 131.107.5.41. And I would save this. So this is where I want these mails to go. And then you can say, hey, issued by a trusted certificate authority, or you could again specify exactly the name of the certificate authority. Let's say in this case, I just say issued by a trusted CA. So what we are telling Office 365 to do here is for all mails that are sent to star.xhybrid.com, send those mails to this smart host and make sure you use TLS and verify the recipient's domain. So now I'm going to go and validate this connector. So I actually have the email address of one of my partners. So I basically say Caillou@Caillou1.xhybrid.com. Remember, I said star@xhybrid.com. So this is one of my partners. Caillou1 is a partner, and this is a user at Caillou1. Say OK. And I go and click the validate button. At this point, we are doing two things. We are first making sure that we can actually connect to your smart host. Now, a lot of times we have realized in the past that people create the connectors, say either misspell the certificate name, they misspell the smart host, or there's a typo in the IP. They don't realize that. They save the connector only to find that mail flow is broken. And when mail flow is broken, obviously people get upset. And when people get upset, they do strange things. So my point is that it is better to get this validated upfront before doing strange things. I'm sounding like that ad, actually. I don't know how many times you guys have watched that. Is that Comcast or DirecTV or something like that? Okay. Anyway, so this connector actually was validated. And you can further click it to see what happened. You can see that we resolved this IP. The connection was successful. It supports TLS and the certificate is OK. And that we were actually able to send mail. And you can see the actual message tracking log here to know that it was sent successfully. Okay? When you do that, you can save. You now have a little more assurance than you had before that things are working correctly when you set up that connector. Okay? All right. That being said, let's now move on. So now I'm going to go into a more complex scenario. Okay? There are a lot of organizations, again, I wouldn't say a lot, but quite a few, that MX doesn't point to their on-premises server. They might use a third-party email service provider. Message Labs was an example I gave you. In this scenario, your MX is pointing to Message Labs, and mail from bob@yahoo.com will first go to Message Labs because that's where MX points. You can see that in the MX record down there. And it then gets sent to contoso.com. So you've been using this third-party email provider to scan your messages or whatnot. And that's how mails were coming in. Do we need a connector for this scenario? Again, the answer is no, but a lot of people do that because, A, they want to enforce TLS between this partner, and it's like a partner. You want to enforce TLS between this shared service and you. You also want to enforce all your outbound mail to go via this shared service. So, in this case, I mean, you're really using two services here, doing double duty, if you will. But that's how customers prefer it. That's okay. So your MX record still points to this third party that's doing the email scanning for you. You also have your mailboxes that are distributed. There are some mailboxes in Office 365, some mailboxes in the cloud. You go ahead and create a connector, and you'd say from this partner organization, so from O365, from your partner organization to O365, you want all that mail to be TLS encrypted. You would also create, now this one is interesting, you also create another connector of type from O365 to your partner organization. Because what you're telling O365 here is, I don't want you to send my mail to the internet. I want you to route all my mail via this partner. And this is a special partner. This is not a partner like bank.com that you have a relationship with. This is your service provider that you want all your inbound and outbound mail to go through. So you would go ahead and say for recipient domain star, it's probably the only place where we would use recipient domain star, you want that mail to actually go out through this partner. So what does that mean? That means when bob@yahoo.com wants to send mail to Jim in the cloud, that mail would first go to, in this case, Message Labs, to the partner, get scanned or whatnot, and then come to Office 365. That's something that they have to do. Office 365 will receive that mail and ensure, A, that all this mail is encrypted because you've created the connector saying that I want all mail from this partner to be encrypted. How will you identify this partner? Because this is all email from the internet coming to you, you can't identify this partner using a domain, a sender domain. It's not just Jack@bank.com sending you mail. It's Bob@Yahoo and Jim@Gmail and so on and so forth sending you mail. So in that scenario, you identify this partner using either a certificate or IPs. And you say that if any mail is coming from these IPs, I want them to be TLS encrypted. And that mail, we'll make sure that it is. And if it is, then we'll send that mail to Jim. On our side, that seamless experience between Jim and John, all those things remain the same. Nothing changes there. But in spite of that, you also have a third-party service provider that you've been using with your MX pointing to that third party. Similarly, when Jim@contoso.com wants to send mail to Bob@Yahoo, when we receive that mail, because you've identified saying that every mail that goes out of O365 to all the internet really, that's domains, recipient domain star, I want all that outbound mail being sent through this partner IPs. And that's why we would go ahead and basically send that mail through this partner, and that's where it would go. So we'd send that mail to the partner who would then route it out. Now all this while, mail from Jim to John is unaffected, and that seamless experience you will still get. Okay? Now, so at this point, what we could do is, I could just show you the way to do this, though without creating one. But you would basically go to the connector UI, and you would say, hey, I want all my outbound mail. So O365, remember this is partner organization, this is not your org. Partner organization, and I would say this is mail from O365 to, in this case, say message to the internet really, or you could say Message Labs because this is your partner. give it a description, and you'd say next. You'd say only when do you want to use this connector? Only when email messages are sent to these domains. Well, guess what? You want to send this for everybody, so email messages send to star. So you'd create this connector, and you would say next. You'd say, how do you want to route this mail? You want us to route this mail using MX record or through these IPs? So in this case, you would give either the FQDN or you would give a bunch of IPs for, say, Message Labs. You need to know those, of course. And I don't know their IPs, so I'm just putting something random, okay? And you would say next. And then how do you want to secure this mail? Say it's using a certificate that's validated by a CA. And then you would have to go through a similar validation process for your outbound mail. You would need to give, say, somebody at yahoo.com, and you would say, I want all these messages routed via this smart host, and if the mail succeeds, and it gets validated, this connector gets created. All right? So it's the same process. Okay, so I've pretty much come to the end of my talk, and I felt like I need to reward you for your commitment to this session, as I said earlier, and the way I do that is with a pop quiz. So I'm going to ask you this question. You might say, wait, hold on, this is going through. All right. So remember, the question is, which connector does Office 365 pick? Jim, right here in Office 365, wants to send a mail to John in the cloud. Or rather, sorry, other way around. Jim in the cloud wants to send mail to John on premises, right? So it's going from Jim at Contoso to John at Contoso. Remember, we have two connectors. We just created them. One, highlighted with the pink arrow, is the connector that says from Office 365 to partner organization with recipient domain star. So all my mail with star, with recipient star, I want to use this connector, send mail to the partner IPs. There's another one that's saying from Office 365 to your organization, but the clause here is your recipient domain equals accepted domains or contoso.com. So there are two, if you will, connectors to choose from. One is, they're both from Office 365. One is to partner organization with recipient domain star. One is with your organization with recipient domain contoso.com or all accepted domains. So which connector would get picked? That's great. That's great. That's right. The second one gets picked because a closer match on recipient domain always wins. Okay, so if it was contoso.com, that would win. Accepteddomains.com wins over star, and then finally star would come into play. Okay, so that's why when Jim sends a mail to John, it doesn't go via the one outside, but it actually goes, when we receive it, it will go via this connector to your on-premise server and gets received by John. All right, so with that, I'm completed my session. Guys, thank you very much for coming. In all seriousness, I appreciate it. Thank you. And this is a summary. So I'm open for questions on the floor. I am also available outside for the next half an hour. If you have any questions you want to ask me, feel free to find me. I have my business card with me. But we are open for any questions on the floor. Please come to the mics. That's my only request, because this session is being recorded and we want the audience to receive the question. Yeah.
So I have a question about, we have a bunch of SMTP relay servers, and we're sending application email through them. But all the recipients are within the Exchange Online. So when we get NDR from other service providers, Office 365 doesn't know the sender, because it's not, I didn't send this email, but I'm getting NDR for it. So almost 99% of them get discarded right away. But we do need the NDRs. So what's the best practice. And the SPF is completely correct. The IPs are mentioned in the SPF. They're not being treated as spam. It's just the fact that the recipient doesn't exist, that the email has been, blocked. So what's the best practice for that?
So I need to understand your scenario a little bit better. When you say, so all your mail users are all your mailboxes are in the cloud, you said that.
Correct.
So they are hosted. And where is your MX pointing?
To the cloud.
To the cloud. And why do you have these relay servers? How are these relay servers coming into play?
Our applications that they send email out, there's 20,000 per application per hour. We can't use SMTP relay services at Office 365.
And where are these applications hosted?
Inside the corporate infrastructure.
Okay. So, and mails from those corporate apps, when they get sent out, what is the sender domain being used? Is that your organization domain?
It is.
It is. So it's basically like contoso.com sending mail out through that app, going via your relay service to the world.
Correct.
And when the world doesn't receive it, you want that NDR. It should go back to your application, except that it actually goes to Office 365 because
MX record are pointing there, yes.
Because the MX record is pointing there. I see. And now, in a situation like this, quite honestly, the way you would do that is if you were to set up your, so I would have first tried to set up accounts, as I said, for user accounts for each of your applications in O365 and send mail from there. But because you said you need to send more than, I think, 10,000, 20,000, yes. I'm assuming that's why you don't do that.
Correct. It's the volume that
now,
10,000 doesn't.
One of the things that you could do, so we do not encourage that kind of volume to begin with, but in a situation like this, you could have your relay servers actually, if it's all on premises, you could have those relay servers send mail to Office 365, and Office 365 send those mails out. I know you see, it might sound surprising, but that limit of 10,000 would not apply because the 10,000 limit applies when you create user accounts and send mail as users. In this case, your applications are actually on premises, and they're not strictly users in the cloud, and so they could send more mail out. Now, that being said, if you want to keep your setup as you have it right now, the mails, the NDRs that come to Office 365, because they come from Yahoo, say for instance, that's rejecting your mail, why is it that we would reject that mail?
Because you're not the sender, so it's the first.
I don't think, for us it wouldn't matter because we would get that mail from Yahoo as long as the SPF check for Yahoo is fine. We would receive that mail and we would do what we need to do, and maybe we would either, if you don't have, for instance, those senders registered in our system, then we would, what is the domain type in Office 365? Do you know by any chance?
Domain type?
Like authoritative or internal relay?
It's authoritative.
Okay. So I am surprised why we would not receive those emails. Even I know we didn't send it.
Right.
Those senders may not exist in the cloud, but it's still email coming to contoso.com, and contoso.com is our.
It meets the first criteria of being spoofed, right? Because Office 365 looks at it and says, "I didn't send you. Why am I getting?"
But those NDRs coming back are not coming back from contoso.com. They are coming back from yahoo.com.
Right.
And that is just like any other mail from yahoo.com coming to Contoso. So we would not know the difference, and we would just accept your email actually. So I'm surprised that those mails are not coming through.
We had to actually write exceptions for those mailboxes to receive those NDRs so far.
So that's interesting. It should have come through. The only other reason I can think of is it happening to all NDRs or just a few? Because you may be sending mail to a bunch of, say, places that are not, when those guys send NDRs back to you, they are sending it from IPs that are on blacklists or block lists, rather, I should say. And that's why we are rejecting those mails. But other than that, I see no reason for those mails being rejected by us. because we wouldn't know any better. That's like a genuine mail coming from Yahoo or from another place to contoso.com, and we host contoso.com. I mean, we can talk about this offline, but I would find it hard to believe.
I'll come and take your card so we can.
Sure, yeah. Hard to believe that mail not coming through. Yeah, do you want to go then? I'll just give me a second. I'll have. Yeah.
As far as enforcing TLS, is there a way that you can require it to check for TLS, and if the person you're emailing, their mail server supports it, it would send it, but if not, it would send it without TLS? Or would that be a bad
That
thing?
is the default behavior, right?
Okay.
The default behavior is if the sender is sending via TLS, I will accept it with TLS.
Okay.
If the sender is not sending via TLS and you've not put a connector to enforce it, we will just accept your mail in the clear.
Okay.
So we use by default what we call opportunistic TLS. Prefer TLS, but if not, we will go without it.
Okay.
So you had a question over there. The gentleman in the mic there? You had a question? No? Okay. Just a hi. Yes.
Hi. In your last scenario, if you want to go to the slide,
Yeah.
if Bob at contoso.com has a forwarding address to Bob at yahoo.com or gmail.com.
So you mean Jim at contoso.com in the
Jim,
cloud, right?
Yeah, Jim at contoso.com
Yeah.
has a forwarding address.
Yes.
In our experience, that
Yes.
message does not traverse back through Message Labs in this example. It will not match on that recipient domain star. Is there any way to get those messages to flow through that connector?
Interesting. I mean, it's the first time I'm hearing that, actually, to be honest with you. And you're saying that with confidence. I mean, you actually know that's what's happening. Why do you say that?
Yeah, well, our connectors were set up a year ago or so, or
Okay.
a couple years ago, so before the new wizard was developed. So maybe we have a misconfiguration, but
No, I think-
I know we have it set for a recipient domain star.
Okay.
And messages that are set through accounts that are set with forwarding SMTP address or using inbox rules to forward, those do not go through our outbound connector.
Interesting. I mean, the only explanation I can get for that, based on knowing the pipeline, is because the SMTP forwarding, what we call it, because you're basically saying this is mail that's going from contoso.com to somewhere outside. That's why it's SMTP. That, what you call agent, that actually sits doing that, applies an override, and it sits much later in the stack. And I think that might be the reason why that mail is actually going directly using MX routing versus using the connector. So it's being routed outside, no problem, but it's actually using MX for routing versus using that connector.
Yeah, it's being delivered directly by Exchange
Okay.
Online.
And the same would go for inbox rules because it's so much further down the stack. It's going to the mailbox, and at that point, that inbox rule is acting on that mail, and it's sending it via But I would still think inbox rules should have gone via that route.
Not in our experience.
Okay. Let me take that back and see whether that's actually happening. But I mean, there are other issues with forwarding, like SPF checks failing and things like that, but
Yeah.
this is the first I've heard of. So you're saying SMTP forwarding or the inbox rules, they do not go through the connector outside.
Right.
I mean, that might be an oversight on our side or something else that's
Or
okay.
a feature request.
No, it shouldn't be a feature. I mean, I don't see a reason why that should be the case. But okay. You might want to just take my card because, and you can email me back in case I forget, so that I know that I can at least follow up. Oops. Did I do something?
We can go back and just verify again.
Yeah. I mean, I'll make you do all sorts of verifications. Don't worry. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. I think I have I can take one more question. Is there a question? And then, I'll give the gentleman the back.
Yeah, we're using centralized mail transport, and I know you didn't cover that.
CMC, the dreaded CMC.
Yeah, we were having a little problem with preservations of headers as it was hitting EOP on the way out for
Yes.
Exchange Online users.
Yes.
Is that
Yes.
something that you guys know about, or?
Yeah, preservation of headers with CMC is problematic, right? Because what happens in this scenario is with CMC, your mail from outside is coming in here. And now CMC, by the way, is only used for mail coming from outside into here that you want to get routed through your organization first, or mail from here to outside. It should not impact mail between these two. So if this is set up correctly, there shouldn't have been a problem because headers are retained over here. Now, and for mail coming from outside or going outside, there's no reason to retain headers for those scenarios.
Yeah, it's mail coming from outside to an Exchange Online user.
But see, mail coming from outside, when it comes in, we strip off all the headers, period. And when it comes in, there are no, we attach no headers when it goes out there because it's mail coming from outside. The seamless existence and the header information that we preserve, our Exchange auth has headers, things that originate they are only there for mail that originated either from a user on premise or on the cloud. Mail that originated from outside, from the internet, we strip off everything. We strip off all the headers coming through.
So what we're seeing is that our edge server that sends mail to our Exchange Online through the hybrid connector, that external domain, it fails the SPF check because the external domain sees our org or our Exchange edge servers as the sending source. And obviously we don't have an SPF record for them, or should we? So it fails the SPF check.
And your MX is probably pointing to your on-premise, right?
It's pointing to EOP, actually.
It is pointing to EOP, which is basically Office 365.
Yeah.
So you have your MX pointing to Office 365. So you have a hybrid situation like this.
We do.
But if you have a hybrid situation like this, mail from outside, when it comes to us, we will send all that mail out to your on-premise server because you have CMC,
Correct.
which will then route back to us.
Correct.
And then we will deliver that mail to the cloud if it's destined for a cloud mailbox.
Yep.
And there are no headers, by the way, preserved in that scenario. I mean, now when it comes back to us, by the way, for instance, it would use the connector, and as long as you've set up, well, when it comes back to us, it should still use the connector. I don't see a reason why it should not. Have you set up your send connector correctly to come to us?
Yeah, we have the hybrid connector with TLS from our on-prem to our Exchange Online.
And if it comes through that connector, it should be, we'll still do the SPF check. The SPF check, now the SPF check might fail because you may not have registered your own IPs with the SPF. Because you need to do both, because in this case, you're still sending mail from your organization.
Yeah,
right?
so
The connector doesn't help there.
Yeah, so we did that, but the SPF check fails because the domain from the external domain is using our IPs.
Yes. Because at the end of the day, that mail is still yahoo.com
Correct.
coming through your IP addresses.
Yep.
Right? And that's why it's failing.
So we were told by Premier Support something about accepted domains and adding our mail.onmicrosoft as well as our on Microsoft and our on-premise accepted domain.
No. I mean, CMC I will say CMC is nasty just because of that reason. SPF checks failing, I can see that failing because of CMC routing. I don't know if I have a solution necessarily off the top of my head.
And this only
for
happened
you.
like December, February, and we heard some things about DMARC, and I don't know if that's...
Well, I
related
think
at
all of those things happened because of two reasons. SPF is getting more popular. In your organization, for instance, when you go to Office 365, it also depends on how you've set your record. So for instance, if I were to show you this UI, and I'm kind of extending my time, so I'll take the rest of the questions outside. But one thing to keep in mind is when you go and select your content filter, or rather, not connection filter, you actually have the option to create your spam policy. And you want to, in this scenario, there is a, let's go and look at an existing one. So you may want to make sure that you do not have in your advanced options, for instance, SPF hard fail set. So if you have this set to on, what that means is any SPF check that fails, when we receive a mail, if that SPF check fails, we will mark the spam score on that really high, and that will cause the chances of your mail being considered spam goes up considerably when you set it up to high, when you set it up to on. So I don't know if you have that set up in your organization.
Yeah, we did. We turned that off, and then we obviously noticed that this happens more for organizations that do have an SPF, whether it's soft or hard fail on their SPF record. And so, I mean, I don't know if it reduces our security posture.
No,
by turning
I
off
don't think
the-
it does, because, I mean, in this case, all your mail is coming in. I mean, it's checked for spam and things like that anyway. This is for you that, because you have the CMC routing, I hate to say this, it's a little more complicated, and you have to relax some. I mean, there's something got to give at this point. And it looks like it's going to have to be this relaxation on your SPF check.
So does that off quarantine it, or does it junk mail it?
No, when you turn it off, it still does the SPF check, but it doesn't increase your spam score by your SCL value, your spam confidence level, very high. If you set it to hard, where you set it to on, it will basically increase it high enough that anything else will just tip it over and will be marked as junk.
All right.
Yeah, CMC routing is complicated, and yeah, all right. At this point, let me take all your questions outside. I'm done. Thank you.